Here on Monday. This week we are engaged in our first chapel series of the year, so this is a chapel every day of the week experience for us this year. This week we are hearing from 3 members of our extended community who are each here to provide a perspective on the meaning of Jerusalem from their lens. My hope is that this chapel series helps us appreciate that there are always stories we may not know. Here I am. And meaning vested in places and in texts and in symbols that a person might carry inside them that we might not understand unless we ask, unless we listen to their stories, unless we try to learn from them with curiosity. And I urge you all to nurture the questions that come up for you, as you did on Monday, as I hope you will today, and listen with a mind toward trying to understand something new, something you hadn't thought of that way before, something about someone else's experience. Let's also remember, as you were reminded on Monday, that each faith leader who's speaking with us this week speaks from the I perspective for themselves, and that within the religious traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there are a wide variety of denominations, sects, traditions, and identities that could never all be represented by a single speaker. So we don't want to put that on any of our speakers. Today, we are pleased to welcome a speaker from the Christian tradition, and tomorrow from a Muslim tradition. And then we are going to end this series on Friday with a Q&A with all 3, with questions generated by you all. Reverend Nichols is again at Historic Downtown Campus this morning. She should be here this afternoon and for our remaining sessions this week to explore questions with you, help you extend your thinking and come up with questions, offer some chaplaincy and guidance as you grapple with and develop along with these new ideas. So today's run of show is that first we're going to get to hear 2 pieces from chorale, and then we're going to have an introduction to our chapel speaker for today, and then we'll let him take it away. So our 2 pieces from chorale this morning, the first is A City Called Heaven, which is going to feature Melly Sankar as soloist, and the second is True Light, featuring Donnie Siddiqui and Melanie Rose Wentham as soloists. Take it away, chorale.
Sometimes I just don't know which is right from wrong. Your glory excites no envy, but let the one who serves you praise you again and again.
Our guest this morning, the Reverend J.C. Austin, is here to share the story of Jerusalem from a Christian perspective. Reverend Austin is pastor and head of staff at the First Presbyterian Church of Bethlehem. Like Rabbi Singer, who spoke on Monday, Reverend Austin is a member of BIG, the Bethlehem Interfaith Group. Prior to coming to Bethlehem, Reverend Austin served as an associate pastor at Madison Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York City and as vice president at Auburn Theological Seminary. He received his Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary, where he received the prestigious Graduate Study Fellowship in Parish Pulpit Ministry, which allowed him to spend a year as a visiting fellow at the University of Cape Town, studying the theological dimensions of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in post-apartheid South Africa. Reverend Austin is an avid traveler as well as a travel scholar, and he has led several trips to Israel and Palestine for pastors, seminary students, and rabbinical students. Please welcome Reverend J.C. Austin.
Thanks for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation to be here. It's good to see all of you this morning. There's a saying that if you've spent a week in Israel and Palestine, you know everything about it. And if you've spent a year there, you know nothing about it. I've spent probably about 6 months, 7 or 8 trips that I've led over there, as well as independent studies. So I know something about it between those, and that's what we'll be talking about. The truth is, we could spend the rest of the year, every chapel service, talking just about the Christian perspectives on this and not exhaust it. So I'm going to try to condense that into 15 minutes and leave that a little bit, if I can, for some questions that are particularly on your mind today. Just remembering we're going to have the panel discussion on Friday for a lot more of this. I think the first thing I want to say is that there's no such thing as a story about Jerusalem from the Christian perspective. It's easier to talk about it in terms of Christian perspectives. And even within that, I'm going to generalize a lot. And so, again, you can ask questions for specificity on that. But I think we can condense this down into a couple of things that will give you at least a better sense of how, on the whole, Christians tend to think about and act towards Jerusalem. So if you can switch the slide. There's really 4 large subgroups of Christians that's important to keep in mind through all of this when we're talking about Jerusalem. Can I get the next slide? There we go. Oh, too far. So 4 large groups. You see on the left, you got Pope Francis, the Roman Catholic Church. And next to the right, you've got a Moravian bishop representing the Protestant Church. You've got the Patriarch of Constantinople from the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is all of the Orthodox traditions in Russia, Syria, all kinds of places. And then on the right, far right, you've got the evangelical tradition. So all of these groups have a lot of different ways of approaching this. I'm going to generalize a bit just so you can get your mind around some of this. But I think the easiest way to talk about this is that all of them tend to approach the story of Jerusalem through the past, present, and future, so through time. We think about Jerusalem in the past, Jerusalem now, and what Jerusalem means in the future. So I think all of those Christian traditions can be summarized in terms of the past, the significance of Jerusalem in Jesus' day, and how that impacts us, the presence in terms of its significance in the contemporary world, and particularly in terms of the ongoing conflict there, and the future, the theological significance of Jerusalem for ultimately the end of time. One of the strange dynamics of Christian approaches to Jerusalem is that today in Israel and Palestine, Christians only make up about 1.5% of the entire population. So most of Christian engagement in Jerusalem is from outside of Jerusalem. And so it's more institutional and traditional, whereas with Jews and Muslims, they make up almost all of the population in terms of Israel-Palestine right there on the ground. So I want to talk first about the past. Why do Christians care about the past in terms of Jerusalem? So if I can get the next slide. The first part is that Christians care about Jerusalem because Scripture tells them to. Both the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian New Testament all talk about Jerusalem as a place where God can be especially found, as a place of God's dwelling place. Jesus sets his face towards Jerusalem and spends most of his ministry with that as a target in mind as he's teaching and healing throughout Galilee and other regions. He spends most of his arguably most important moments in Jerusalem in terms of his story of arrest and crucifixion and death and resurrection. All of that happens there in Jerusalem. So God's dwelling place is important, and if I can get the next slide, walking where Jesus walked is important. So Christians think about this in terms of Jesus was there. By definition, it's important, we believe, that God came to earth in the person of Jesus and walked around. So the fact that Jesus came to Jerusalem is important in and of itself. So moving along a little bit, the way Christians tend to engage in Jerusalem then is through this idea of walking where Jesus walked. So if I can get the next slide. You see, this is a typical group of contemporary pilgrims, people who have journeyed to Israel and Palestine. This is almost every tour of Christians to Jerusalem. This is the first stop. They all have this picture somewhere. It's just different people in the front. But the bus goes from the airport, it goes to this overlook, that overlooks the Temple Mount and Old Jerusalem, and you can see it all there, and this happens for everybody. The connection is, though, putting themselves in the story, putting themselves into what's been told there. And that's particularly true for Protestants and for evangelicals because they don't have institutional connections to the holy sites. The Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church actually have responsibilities for taking care of most of the holy sites that are in Jerusalem. So the places that are traditionally the location of things like where Jesus was crucified, where his body was laid, where his tomb was, all of that. And they have responsibility for taking care of those areas. And so there's a literal sense of ownership over the sites. Protestants, evangelicals are more geared towards the story, more geared towards putting themselves into that story. So if you see the next slide here, no, we're missing one. Can you go back one? Okay, well, what should be there? Actually go forward two and just see if it's out of order. No, one more. There we go, we'll have to come back. This is really in the present, but it deals with the past. Can you all see the ladder there that's circled? That ladder has been on that ledge, which is about 3 or 4 stories up on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the church in Jerusalem where a lot of the sites of Jesus' crucifixion and death are commemorated. It's at that window. It's been there for over 300 years, propped right there, because of what's called the status quo, which is the Ottoman Empire made a declaration as to who was responsible for what sites in terms of the Orthodox and the Catholic churches. And that's held to today, to the point that nobody can move this ladder, because if they do, it breaks the status quo and it will literally start a fist fight with the different groups. There have been groups that take this so seriously in terms of this is our area to take care of, and this is your area to take care of, that if one group sweeps the dust in another group, they have to pull them apart, which I'd be very curious to see what Jesus had to say about that. But that's part of the dynamics. And so there's this sense of great responsibility for the sites and for taking care of that, particularly among Orthodox and Catholic Christians. So let's back up a little bit. One more. Yeah, okay. So there's also tends to be differences of engagement here. This is the tomb of Jesus that's inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You can see it's a very ornate, beautiful church that surrounds it, and then this tomb has got a large veneration with a lot of art on top of it and all of those kinds of things. This is classic Catholic and Orthodox sort of spirituality. For Protestants and evangelicals, this tends to be a little unfamiliar. They are looking for the story and experiencing the story, and they walk in and say, this is a beautiful church, but I don't really get how this is the tomb in which Jesus' body was buried. So if you go to the next slide, see, this is what the tomb's supposed to look like. This is a place called the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem. It looks like it is a first century tomb that is very similar to the one that Jesus' body would have been laid out. I talked to somebody who was there that was a faith leader that would lead people through there and said, despite what some of the tour guides will tell you, there's no historical significance to this in terms of Jesus at all. But, as this guide put it, this isn't where Jesus was buried, but it should have been. This is what people are looking for in terms of the Protestant and evangelical tradition of kind of putting themselves into the story. This feels like what it would have been like. It allows people to imagine what it would have been like to be there on Easter morning, where Scriptures tells us that the women came to care for the body and found the tomb with the stone already rolled away, and this is what it would have looked like. So these different engagements different ways of both presenting the story and being a part of the story are really important to understand that there is not a one Christian perspective on all that. Okay, so let's go back to the present. We can skip forward over the ladder. This, I think, in the present is one of the places where it's important to understand some of these differences. There's, I think, common concerns among all Christians in terms of Jerusalem, in terms of preserving access to the holy sites, ability to worship, concerns about security and justice and peace for both Israelis and Palestinians, but the emphasis on that can vary from tradition to tradition, congregation to congregation, Christian to Christian. So I'm going to dramatically overgeneralize here, but I think it's a fair way of saying it, that the most Palestinian Christians, and again, Palestinian Christians as a whole make up only 1.5%. Most of them are some form of either Roman Catholic or Orthodox. And so those traditions tend to focus on both maintaining the holy sites and concern for Palestinian well-being in terms of justice and security under the occupation of East Jerusalem. In recent decades, the Protestant churches have gotten even more interested in that. And so there are Protestant Christians who are there, and there's a lot of partnership that goes back and forth and visitation, and supporting pilgrimages, not just for the holy sites, but pilgrimages to meet with other Christians, with fellow Christians, and understand something about what it means to be Christian and living in the contemporary environment. That has caused some tension both within Protestant churches in terms of arguing over what it means to be showing solidarity with both Israeli Jews and Palestinian Christians and Muslims, and between Christians, Protestant Christians, and particularly the U.S. Jewish community over how we sort all this out. And so if you've heard any of those kinds of conversations where there's been tension between those, that's part of what it's about. Evangelicals have been more varied on this. Some of them would be similar to Protestants on that, but there's also a strong contingent in the evangelical church that are focused primarily on the present of Jerusalem in terms of the future of Jerusalem. That it's the site where Jesus will ultimately return, and so there's a lot more solidarity with the state of Israel in terms of preserving that as a place where Jesus will ultimately return. What am I doing on time? Okay, I'm going to speed up. So we've done past and present in 10 minutes. That's not too bad. Future. Go forward a little bit. Yeah, okay, this is fine. So we can spend a lot of time on this, and there's some metaphorical and even literal fireworks in here, but I think this is, in a way, the biggest divide within Christianity in terms of how we approach the future of Jerusalem. There is the position that I was talking about earlier that's kind of represented by the image on the left here, the idea of Jesus coming back to Jerusalem in sort of fire and glory and judging people for their sins and all of those sorts of things. And that tends to be most prominent within the evangelical communities, though it bridges all four of those traditions. The one on the right is represented, this is an image that's playing off of a Christian scripture that talks about the future of Jerusalem as a place where the lion and the lamb will lie down together and none will be harmed on my holy mountain, is what scripture says. And that tends to be another way of approaching the future of Jerusalem as a place not focused so much on judgment, but on redemption, on reconciliation, on a place where there'll be a full relationship between God and all peoples that's characterized by love and justice and mercy and peace. And so those images are in there. They're not just symbols. These are faith commitments and theological commitments in terms of what God's up to. And so Jerusalem becomes symbolic, but not in the sense of just a symbol that doesn't really mean anything. It's a symbol in the sense of it kind of condenses all of those beliefs down into what we think God's up to in the world, and that Jerusalem becomes a place where people come together either for judgment or for reconciliation and peace, and maybe even some combination of all of those things. So if you talk to 10 Christians, you'll probably get 12 to 15 different perspectives on this. But in terms of just a basic kind of perspective on that, I think that's helpful. So you've got these 4 broad traditions with a lot of subgroups within them, all of whom are thinking about how we fit into the story of Jerusalem and how Jerusalem fits into the story that we believe God is telling and acting out in the world in terms of what has already happened, in terms of what's happening right now in the world, and in terms of where we're going. Hopefully Christians across the board, and this is personal commentary at this point, but hopefully Christians across the board see themselves within that story as agents of partnership with all the peoples that live in Jerusalem and in the land surrounding it, and are working for reconciliation and peace, because that is a part of what the ultimate goal is here, regardless of where your emphasis is. Now, I've got about 10 minutes, I think, to go on, so I'm going to stop and just see what questions or feedback or discussion you might have. Again, we'll have some more time on Friday, but I want to stop here and see if there's anything particular you want to focus on the time we got left. Questions for clarification? Yeah.
So in your experience, what kinds of questions, conversations, or dialogues have you had with members of other faiths in reference to the past, present, and future of Jerusalem?
Great. So the questions, what in my experience have been conversations with people of other faiths about past, present, and future. I'd say I've led and participated in trips that have involved Christian pastors, Jewish rabbis, Muslim imams, as well as people who are training to become those, so seminary students, rabbinic students, and so on. And so those conversations tend to be rich, but they take a while to get there. There's a lot of trust that has to get built up. And part of what we've done in the trips that I've led is there's a combination of space for people to have conversations together, but also to split apart in terms of those faith groups. Because often we find Christians or Muslims or Jews or whoever it is, well, there'll be a disagreement within the group that they don't want to air in the larger group before having talked about it first. And so creating space for that is really important. I think the sense of trust building is the hardest part of all of that. It's not that hard to go and be moved by the holy sites, to be interested in, the technical aspects of how Christians feel about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or Jews or Muslims feel about Al-Aqsa or the Temple Mount. Actually getting into telling people's own stories of why is this important to you, and what does this mean for you, and what's at stake for you in this is much harder, which is why I think it's great that you all are having these conversations in chapel here, because it's equipping you to be able to do that. And that's what it's going to take long term for us to truly be able to understand one another and be in partnership. And the less we take those risks and create space for that kind of courageous vulnerability, the harder it is to really talk about or experiencing anything that's meaningful in all of this. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah.
How did the creation of the Old Testament and the Jewish faith influence the creation of the New Testament?
Okay.
Where do you go, Mike?
Questions, how did the creation of the Old Testament and the Jewish faith influence the creation of the New Testament and the Christian faith? Okay. We need a lot more time. But the short version of that is you can't understand Christianity without understanding Judaism. The Christian scriptures themselves are both the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, as we call it, and the New Testament. We organize it a little bit differently, but it's the same scriptures in terms of the Jewish scriptures and the Christian scriptures, but we read it somewhat differently. But it's all there, and there's an awful lot in common. And if you read the Christian New Testament, there's almost a constant level of allusion and referencing and direct quotations and Easter eggs, in the New Testament. They're all referring back to that. Jesus himself was a faithful, practicing Jew. You can't understand Jesus if you don't understand what that means for him to be observing Sabbath and going to synagogue and doing all of those kinds of things. So it's impossible to, I think the simplest way to understand that is it's an absolutely massive influence to the point where Christianity doesn't make sense if you don't appreciate its Jewish heritage and influence and ongoing conversation. In the back.
Of all your trips, you did lots of trips to all these different sites, which one holds the most personal connection to you?
That's a good question. There was one that I led that was particularly notable because it was of the diversity of their participation. So we had, this one was just Christians and Jews, but within that we had Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Evangelical, and Protestant from several different traditions in Protestantism for the Christian side. And on the Jewish side, we had Reform Jews, Conservative Jews, Reconstructionist Jews, and Orthodox Jews. And the last of those was particularly important because we had not been able to incorporate them on previous trips. And there was a day where we were outside of Jerusalem, we're actually in the West Bank, and we were doing an overnight with Palestinian families for people to understand what it means to just simply live in the West Bank under the current conditions. And this Palestinian family was taking in one of the Orthodox rabbinic students, whose father was very nervous about this. And they actually talked about it once they had separated. I got this story later. But he was sitting in the house and he was telling him, you know, my father's nervous about this. And he said, well, do you have a cell phone? And he said, yes. And so they called back to New York City. And the Palestinian father said, your son's my son tonight. And there's nothing to worry about. Now that doesn't solve the larger problems and the conflicts and things like that, but that kind of understanding and mutual care and connection on the commonality of being a parent, I think went a long way. And that student came back with he thought of himself as knowing everything. He'd lived in Israel for years, he'd studied there, but he'd never spent time in the Palestinian community. And he came back with a radically different understanding of the conflict and of everyday life and those kinds of things. And so who knows what fruit that will bear ultimately. So that's those moments of personal transformation where people are able to get out of the comfortable story they're in and place themselves in the larger uncomfortable story, I think is where I get hope from doing that kind of work. Yeah, over here.
How does Jerusalem factor into your Christianity in America when you're not there?
How does it factor into Christianity when we're not there? I think it's, again, it's this sort of typology of past, present, and future. It's the history of Jerusalem in terms of understanding Scripture, and it comes up in worship constantly, and those kinds of things. There's a sense of connection, I think, to the present that's not necessarily the same as in other similarly conflicted areas. And so we see Christians, I see myself, and I think a lot of Christians see ourselves as having a stake in the future of Jerusalem, the well-being of Jerusalem, the fullness of Jerusalem as a place where Palestinians and Jews, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews, Palestinians and Israelis, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews can freely worship, can live together, can feel safe, all of those sorts of things. I think the truth is we probably spend less time thinking about the future of Jerusalem, and other than this sort of goal of everything we're doing in our faith is hopefully building up signs of what we think God wants this world to be, a place of greater community and love and justice and peace. And so Jerusalem becomes a place to do that, as well as a symbol to do that. And so the future is probably less important. The past and the present, I think, are pretty constant. Does that get at what you're asking? Okay. We got time for maybe one more, two more?
Thank you. Would you say that I'm sorry, it's really loud. Would you say that the importance of Jerusalem to Christianity and Judaism is comparable to the importance of Mecca to the Muslim religion?
I think it'd probably be better to ask the imam that question.
I'm gonna say thank you for saying that. Remember what we said last week? So these questions will be directed to JC as a practitioner and minister in the Christian tradition. So we're gonna focus our questions to Christianity right now.
Yeah, and I think I'd say my hunch is it's important, but in different ways. And so part of what I think you'll get out of the conversation with him and with the three of us together on Friday is a better sense of how that plays together. So for example, in the Christian tradition, Mecca is not a part of our tradition, so we don't have a deep attachment to that. So it's hard for me to respond.
Thank you.
Got one sort of mid, okay, 1, 2.
Is it me?
Yeah.
Hi. That image of the ladder was so interesting.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've been thinking quite a lot about throughout this series is this idea that with the existence of one shared Holy Land, you know, and this very strongly held beliefs from millions of people throughout all of human history, essentially, I mean, most of it, how do we square with, you mentioned that moving that ladder would result in coming to blows. How do we square with the violence that from your perspective, that has come out of the existence of a Holy Land all throughout history and today?
Well, I think the thing with the ladder is an interesting microcosm because that's what the stakes are just within Christianity. In other words, the debate over that isn't between Christians and Jews or Christians and Muslims. It's just the different expressions with Christianity. And I think, violence is usually not the first resort of people, and it's often, chosen because it's seen as the only option that's left. To sort of overgeneralize. And so I don't think violence is something to be rationalized. I think it can be understood in terms of levels of frustration, despair, lack of other options, self-defense, perceived self-defense, all of that. And that's true of everybody who's committing it. I think for me, one of the most powerful experiences in Jerusalem specifically has been interacting with what's known as the Parents Forum. And it's a nonprofit organization that brings together people who've lost family members in the violence. And they have a very powerful message of whatever the answer is, this isn't it. And so you've got Israeli Jews who've lost a child in a bus bombing, let's say, back when that was happening a lot, with Palestinians whose children have been shot, as part of the occupation or whatever it might be. And there's a level of tragic mutual understanding in those conversations that provides a lot of moral capital in that sense for people to be able to say, we have got to find a better way of doing this because violence is at best keeping even worse things from happening, and that's the best case scenario. And that's not going to be enough. The only way we can go forward and achieve what we all want, which is to love our children and have generations in love and peace, is to try to understand one another and figure out how to live together. And so hopefully it won't take that level of loss to change that conversation.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. I see that we're all making connections and deepening our understanding as we had part 2 today. We will have part 3 tomorrow, and we'll be able to welcome Reverend Austin back on Friday. There will be information sent out to you and to advisors as we start thinking about what our collective questioning will be in the Q&A, so stay tuned. But in the meantime, let's please thank Reverend Austin for his time today. We had to reschedule due to the snow day, and it's Ash Wednesday, so thank you very much for making the time.